That was fantastic, thank you. Finally, our last award is the John H. Gibbon Jr. Award. This award is the highest honor in the field of perfusion, presented only to those individuals who have made outstanding contributions to the science and practice of extracorporeal circulation. Affectionately, for those of you who don't know Dr. Joe, known as Dr. Joe, Joe spent 20 years as the division director for the CVP program at MUSC. At the time of his retirement, he was the longest-running program director in the college. He mentored over 400 perfusion students, many of whom are in this audience today. He led the efforts to not only elevate MUSC to a graduate curriculum in 2026, but also develop a post-professional program for working professionals to achieve a graduate degree. He himself was a perpetual student, completing a bachelor's in cardiopulmonary technology and respiratory therapy, master's degree in both public administration and healthcare and clinical research, and a PhD in health and rehabilitation science. Before arriving to MUSC in 1994, Joe was the chief of perfusion at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital and Montefiore Hospital in New York City, two of the busiest cardiac surgical programs on the East Coast. In Charleston, he has served as division director, chief of perfusion, and practicing perfusionist. He leaves behind 45 years of clinical service. There have been dozens of team members and colleagues, past and present, that have benefited from Joe's contributions. He was an active researcher. MUSC has published more student scientific research than any other training program in the country. He has authored over 75 scientific articles and has presented nearly 120 times during his career. Since 2012, Joe has mentored over 35 student research projects. More importantly, though, he has mentored MUSC students to be lifelong learners and compassionate professionals. Many students who have graduated from the programs are leaders within the communities that they serve. But perhaps his greatest achievements are as a loving husband and father, here pictured with his wonderful wife, Debbie, and his two children, Brian and Jamie, son-in-law, Stephen, and daughter-in-law, Kathy. All have been exceptionally proud of his career and his complications. And most recently, the birth of his two grandchildren, Micah and Blake, who are already following in Joe's footsteps as a musician. Lastly, Joe is a generous and kind soul. He is committed to community service and volunteerism, here pictured with the class serving the local community in Charleston. Joe is always quick to pull out his guitar or musical instrument. In fact, Joe is volunteering his time at the local VA hospital, teaching guitar lessons to veterans as part of the Guitars for Vets program, offering lessons, instruments, and musical healing to patients coping with physical or emotional injuries. I'd like to introduce this year's John H. Gibbon Award. Please join me in welcoming Joe Cestino. All right, I'd like to welcome Joe to the stage to share a few words.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Tammy. I'm so honored to receive this award. The Gibbon Award was established in 1974, and I've attended many Gibbon Awards over the years. In the beginning, his wife, Maley, also known as Mary Gibbon, but they call her Maley Gibbon, presented the award at AmSect in the early years, and I remember a lot of those presentations. John Gibbon was a thinker. At the age of 16, he enrolled in Princeton University to study philosophy and art. He graduated Princeton at the age of 19 and began medical school at Jefferson Medical College. His father was a prominent surgeon in Philadelphia and encouraged him to enter medical school. After completing his first year of medical school, he wanted to drop out, but he was talked out of it by his father. He said the first year of medical school was frankly boring as hell, all needless memorization. His overall opinion of medical school was, quote, teaching the minutiae of medical and surgical specialties to undergraduate medical students should be thrown out. Obviously, he had many other ideas. After graduation from medical school, and some of you know some of these details, he began his first year of fellowship in 1930 at Mass General Hospital. After 8 months of training, he witnessed a patient dying from a pulmonary embolus. He then developed the prototypes. He was doing research on pulmonary embolism. He developed prototypes of many of the instruments used to occlude the pulmonary artery. In 1934, he requested an additional year of research from Dr. Churchill at Mass General with the sole purpose of developing the heart-lung machine. Dr. Churchill was not very enthusiastic, but nevertheless, he offered the position to Dr. Gibbon, doubting that he would ever achieve his goal. It was during that 1 year that he developed many of the key components of the heart-lung machine, including the oxygenator, the venous reservoir, and the arterial pump. In 1935, Dr. Gibbon demonstrated artificial circulation could maintain life in cats for up to 2 hours and 51 minutes, and that normal circulation could be reestablished. And get this, he was only 32 years old at the time. Amazing. Dr. Gibbon recounted the first time he successfully maintained oxygenation after complete occlusion of the pulmonary artery. He said, although it gives me great satisfaction to know that open heart operations are being performed daily around the world, nothing in my life has duplicated the joy of that dance around the laboratory. After meeting Maley at Dr. Churchill's lab in the early 1930s, and after working closely in the lab, they became engaged in 1932. Dr. Gibbon often felt that his wife's contributions to his scientific achievements were vastly underrated. The first successful operation was 23 years later. Today, I would like to recall some of the critical events that occurred during the first operation. Fortunately, Mark Cruz interviewed Dr. Bernard Miller, who was a senior resident at the time, and he helped to operate the heart-lung machine. Mark documented the case in this article in Osayo in 2012. As noted in the abstract, there were some serious complications, and I'm going to quote some events from this operation, from this article. The Mayo Gibbon heart-lung machine had 5 roller pumps, 2 for drawing venous blood from the vena cava, 1 for systemic perfusion, 1 for recirculation of the arterial blood to maintain a film on the stationary screens for gas exchange. The venous pumps were servo-regulated with flutter valves to prevent collapse of the vena cava. The arterial pump was servo-regulated by a blood level sensor at the base of the arterial reservoir. The recirculation and arterial pumps had high-pressure sensors that would automatically stop the pumps if pressure exceeded 300 millimeters of mercury. Gas exchange occurred as the venous blood was distributed over a manifold inside the top of a rigid, clear plastic chamber and then cascaded down 8 vertical screens in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. There was no heat exchanger. The patient was an 18-year-old female who had been hospitalized 3 times for right heart failure. Cardiac catheterization demonstrated a large ASD with a 9 liter per minute left to right shunt. The patient became cyanotic when walking only a few steps. The heart-lung machine was primed early in the morning with several units of fresh whole blood that had been anticoagulated with heparin. During previous animal experiments, each fresh unit of blood had the equivalent, it was in milligrams then, but now equivalent of 2,500 units of heparin added to prevent clotting. But for the clinical case on May 6th, blood bank personnel made an error and added only 1,000 units of heparin to each unit of donor blood. So you know where this is going, right? At the onset of bypass, blood flow was gradually increased to 3.3 liters a minute from 1.6. Over the next few minutes, a major problem developed when blood began foaming and leaking from the top of the oxygenator. Attempt to stop leak was recorded on the handwritten notes taken during the perfusion. 1 minute later, high pressure developed in the arterial pump tubing and the recirculation pump flow had to be decreased. A few minutes later, blood film on the 3 screens was lost, leading to inadequate oxygenation. The oxygen saturation from the first arterial blood sample was 56%, and the second one, 15 minutes later, dropped to 31%. The blood was black, according to one eyewitness. The pH progressively declined during the course from 7.41 to 7.20. Dr. Gibbon looked over to Bernard Miller and yelled, "BJ, do something." Dr. Miller broke scrub because the two perfusionists that were operating the case were very junior physicians, junior residents. Dr. Miller had done a lot of research in the lab. And so he broke scrub, assisted in replacing blood, eventually depleting all available blood units. Then he added saline solution to the circuit, and they came off bypass. But this time another serious problem developed. Because of blood clotting and loss of circulating volume, the low-level sensor shut down all the roller pumps. At this point, Dr. Miller quickly bypassed the recirculation pump, which allowed some blood to refill the reservoir, and began manual operation of the venous and arterial pumps to maintain perfusion. Venous pump bypassed the oxygenator, and last several minutes were for circulatory support alone. I think they were ventilating during that time. So based on this description, both oxygenator failure and pump failure occurred all in this one case. Dr. Gibbon quickly closed the atriotomy. Sounds like when you read the report that he was being told what to do by the residents at some points. So he said, "Hey, put a clamp on the right atrium." So Dr. Miller quickly closed the atriotomy with a Satinsky clamp so that the patient could be rapidly weaned from bypass. Because of these near catastrophic events, there was some concerns for the patient's neurological status, and anesthesia was stopped. The patient woke up on the table when the skin sutures were being placed. However, by 9 p.m. the evening of surgery, the patient was extubated, maintaining an adequate blood pressure, and was completely lucid, according to the resident's note. The patient recovered completely and was discharged from the hospital on day 13. Here is a picture of the patient 10 years later with President Lyndon Johnson. Dr. Gibbon performed 4 bypass operations, and this is the only one that survived. After that, he declared a moratorium on cardiac surgery. Because of extensive laboratory experiments, and in addition to developing key components for bypass, he also developed many perfusion techniques that we use today. Some were rediscovered many years later, such as vacuum-assisted venous return. Dr. Gibbon had many leadership roles in surgical societies. He also received the Lasker Award for clinical research, which is considered equivalent to the Nobel Prize in the United States. After his retirement in 1967, he enjoyed painting and tennis. Here he is showing a painting of his wife at a reunion on his farm at the Thomas Jefferson Medical School class reunion. He retired on his farm in Pennsylvania and died suddenly after a second heart attack in 1973, following a game of tennis. He was only 69 years old. Unfortunately, he was a cigarette smoker, and that might have contributed to his heart condition and early demise. John Gibbon used poetry as a medium for introspection, and his last known written poem was at the age of 68, less than a year prior to his death. The poem focused on the meaning of Dr. Gibbon's life and harkens back to the strong foundation of philosophy and religion. Having lived 68 years, I don't know who I am, why I am, or where I am. I only know that I am. Now, this instant of time, this no-dimensional dot in the geometry of the universe. After millions of successful open-heart operations, I would dare to say that his impact of life is much more than a no-dimensional dot, and we all here today as witness to that fact. The John Gibbon Award was established in 1974, shortly after his death. In the early years, many recipients were surgeons, and the first perfusionist to be honored was Jim Deering. They were all scientists, had many publications. They challenged tradition by rethinking the status quo. A couple of examples. Denton Cooley had almost 1,100 publications and 23,000 citations. John Kirkland had 700 publications. Walt Lilly had 382 publications and 12,000 citations. Norm Shunway, 500 publications. Michael DeBakey, 500 publications. But the winner is Robert Bartlett, more than 1,100 publications and still publishing. But today we're in a different era than John Gibbon. With advances in access to information and technology, knowledge is increasing at an increasing rate. In 1950, it took about 50 years for knowledge in medicine to double. By 1980, medical knowledge was doubling every 7 years, and by 2010, it was doubling in half that time. This slide shows how much more quickly technology is adopted today. It took 71 years for 50% of Americans to get a telephone, but only 10 years for 50% of Americans to get internet access. Adam Grant describes in his book, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, how technology is affecting us and how we can choose to think about it. The accelerating pace of change that means that we need to question our beliefs more readily than ever before. As we sit with our current beliefs, they tend to become more extreme and more entrenched. How often do we question our beliefs? Do we think as a scientist, a preacher, a prosecutor, a politician, or a cult leader? If you are a scientist, rethinking is fundamental to your profession. You are paid to constantly aware of the limits of your understanding. You are expected to doubt what you know, be curious about what you don't know, and update your views based on new ideas, based on new data. In the past century alone, this has led to dramatic scientific progress. We should all attempt to think as scientists. What happens when we don't think as scientists? The inventor of the BlackBerry learned it the hard way. He had a company worth $70 billion in 2008, but BlackBerry remained the sole product. The founder of that company did not believe that people would type on a screen. The company's failure was the result of failure in rethinking as a CEO. Here are some reasons not to rethink what you're doing. That will not work here. We heard this. That's the way we've always done it. It's too complicated. That's not what my experience has shown. In 2004, a small group of engineers, designers, and marketers pitched Steve Jobs on turning their hit product, the iPod, into a phone. His response was, why the F-U-C-K, I'm sure he didn't spell it, would we want to do that? That's the dumbest idea I ever heard. Jobs was worried about cannibalizing thriving iPod business. He hated cell phone companies, and he would sometimes smash his phone to pieces in frustration when his calls dropped. Yet some of Apple's engineers worked together to persuade him what he didn't know, that he didn't know what he didn't know. After 6 months, he gave in, and the rest is history. Apple is the first company to be valued at $3 trillion, and I'm sure everybody here has an Apple phone, almost. I've had the opportunity to rethink perfusion many times in my 45-year career. I started at one hospital, Long Island Jewish, then went to Winthrop Hospital, back to Long Island Jewish, then to Montefiore, Columbia Presbyterian, and then the Medical University of South Carolina. When I started, and some of you here can relate to this, there were no arterial filters, no membrane oxygenators, no centrifugal pumps, no water transfusion machines, no cardioplegia, no heart assist devices, and zero survival for single ventricle patients. I hope that I approached it as a scientist, but unfortunately I made some errors. But I learned along the way and hopefully pass on some of that knowledge to students. I'll give you some examples. When I first started, the hospital I worked at did not use arterial filters. We had fast surgeons, low mortality rate. We used a stainless steel bubble trap with a large metal screen. Every so often when cleaning the bubble trap, I would find fibrin strands or clots on the screen at the end of bypass. Our heparin protocol was to give 1/4 of the initial loading dose every hour, and if it was towards the end of bypass, we had to ask permission from the surgeon to give additional heparin. When I moved to another hospital, I became interested in a 40-micron screen filter, which was introduced by a neurosurgeon named Patterson, who was at New York Hospital. He was concerned about neurological injury after bypass. Use of arterial filters was controversial at that time. There was an article published around called Extracorporeal Pump Filter, Saint or Sinner. Since there was no method of monitoring anticoagulation, the increased surface area of arterial filters was causing filters to fail during bypass and platelet counts to decrease. I initiated a small study in 10 patients where we randomized patients to the use of a disposable arterial filter, and we used manual ACT tubes to monitor anticoagulation. I found there was almost a very small, almost insignificant decrease in platelets in the arterial filter group. And the advantage of having an arterial filter to prevent massive air embolism certainly favored its use. One day I had a mitral valve replacement case, and the surgeon put in a Bjork-Shiley prosthetic valve. The valve annulus was heavily calcified, and following the replacement, the posterior wall of the annulus tore and was bleeding profusely behind the heart. The surgeon tried several times to stop the bleeding and finally said, come off bypass, give protamine, and keep the pump suckers going until the pump clotted. He said, we're not going to go back on bypass. Well, you know what happened. As soon as the pump clotted, he said, set up another pump. So you can imagine, I was extremely upset about this, not only losing the patient, but the fact that he initially told me that we're not going to go back on bypass. I guess I believed him. Finally, the case, I met with the chief surgeon who said to me to get an auto transfusion machine. I didn't know what they were. So I attended right after that, I attended a hemonetics conference in Boston. I became very interested in blood conservation, reducing hemodilution in small prime circuits. The switch to membrane oxygenators was a challenge. Initially, they were much more expensive, so we used them only on the most complex cases. Eventually, we decided if we converted 100% to membrane, we could get a better deal and save money and have a better product. There were several large institutions, Mayo, Mass General, Johns Hopkins, that continue to use bubble oxygenators after the majority of hospitals had switched to membranes. Finally, the manufacturers announced they would no longer produce bubble oxygenators and forced the large institutions to change. When I first started, there was no cardioplegia. Some hospitals use coronary perfusion, but at the hospital I was at, Long Island Jewish, we used ischemic arrest, similar to Texas Heart Institute. We had fast surgeons. They published a paper in 1975 with 200 operations in a row without a mortality. So why change anything? I attended a conference that showed there was a significant change in cardiac function 5 years after ischemic arrest. Many of the patients who initially did great later developed congestive heart failure, and this was especially true for valve patients who had longer ischemic times. So cardioplegia was the holy grail that was going to prevent this. During this time, I changed to a hospital that used crystalloid cardioplegia. Initially, that was a disaster. Any cross-clamp time over an hour was associated with significant cardiac dysfunction and weaning from bypass. However, once we started using blood cardioplegia, there was a major change and significant reduction in mortality. Ben Mitchell taught me about ventricular assist. Ben Mitchell was the chief perfusionist at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. He started in 1953 in the lab doing perfusion research and coined the term perfusionist. He was the 1995 Gibbon Award recipient. Robert Litwack was the surgeon, and he used implantable VAD cannulas that would remain in the patient after ventricular assist. So they didn't have to take the patient back to the operating room these silicone catheters just stayed right in the patient. They put an obturator in it, and they buried it under the skin. I attended a conference where we had a lecture first, and then we went to the animal lab and practiced ventricular assist. This is the model that I used for our perfusion conference and for many years at MUSC. A roller pump was used for ventricular assist. Of course, they monitored left atrial pressure and kept that above 10. But the roller pump was used for ventricular assist, and he had 12 feet of tubing, so it could be walked through the raceway periodically. This is incredible article was published in 1976. They had 14 ventricular assist patients, and 9 survived and 6 left the hospital. That's amazing. Roller pump, ventricular assist, 1976. But many of the techniques they use for managing ventricular assist patients we still use today. When I first started using centrifugal pumps, they were advertised as low pressure pump. No need for tie bands, did not pump air. I didn't really understand initially that they could generate a very high pressure at high RPMs. The first problem was when I tried to initiate left heart assist with high RPMs and a clamp on the pump inlet. This created a sudden high pressure at the venous cannula tip and caused entrapment and poor venous return. I have also witnessed femoral dissection caused by high RPMs with centrifugal pumps. I tried to demonstrate these properties to students so they don't make the same mistake. One day on bypassing the pig lab, I turned the RPMs all the way up and clamped the arterial line to demonstrate high pressure and blew the arterial line apart. In hindsight, I should have done that demo in the sim lab to avoid getting pig blood all over my face. The first case study I published after a presentation was at a local New York, after a presentation at a local New York perfusion meeting. At that time, slides were made by typing on a white piece of paper and taking a photograph of each slide. Jeff Riley was present. He was the editor of the journal at the time and came up to me and suggested that I write it up for the journal. My next presentation was a survey of blood conservation techniques that I presented at AmSect in Anaheim, California. I used special blue slides for the presentation that cost $5 each. The presentation after me at AmSect was on separating conjoined twins using deep hypothermia on 2 bypass machines at Johns Hopkins. So I remember having a very, very big audience when I did my first presentation at AmSect. When I started in perfusion, there was no treatment for single ventricle. I thought single ventricle was the anatomy, and there was just one very large VSD. I didn't understand why the surgeon couldn't just fix it with a large patch, just put a patch in there. Later, I learned that single ventricle was a physiological model, and there was really a hypoplastic left ventricle and a normal right ventricle. But because I was so interested in long-term outcomes in these neonatal patients, that became my PhD thesis. We all have the potential to contribute to medical literature. We are all scientists. Conducting research is an opportunity to learn new ideas by reviewing the literature and questioning what we do and rethink a better way. These are some of the new techniques that are currently being funded through research grants and will influence perfusion practice in the future. We heard about AI this morning, and I really believe there is going to be a future with AI. Although we heard Jim Gaffigan, if you heard of him, I heard him last week. He was in Savannah, and he said that anything with the word artificial has a bad connotation in it. So I don't know what's going to happen with AI, but I'm sure it's going to be incorporated. And there's a lot of things that I can see where it could be used with bypass. Administration of bypass, you just have to go to the exhibit hall to say all these small circuits that are there. Tubing to minimize coagulation, preserve platelets. There's a grant now for nitric oxide emitting tubing that emits nitric oxide. Inline monitoring, I think in the future we'll have anticoagulation inline monitoring, lactate inline monitoring. And elimination of lipids and pump suctions, that's something that definitely needs to be addressed. Advances in resuscitation, David Palmer knows a lot about that, following cardiac arrest. New heart assist devices, organ printing rather than mechanical devices, and endoscopic cardiac surgery. They're doing a lot of that at Boston Children's Hospital now, research-wise, to try and repair congenital heart defects. Peter Atta, in his book Outlive, described lifespan and health span in terms of medicine 1, 2, and 3. Medicine 1 was the increase in lifespan that occurred from 1900 to 2000 due to the use of antibiotics and vaccines. The average lifespan in the US has increased from 45 to 75 years of age during the past 100 years. Here you can see a gravestone of my ancestors from the 1800s, and the first thing you notice is how young they were when they died, many in their 40s and 50s. Lifespan is how long you live, but we need lifespan is how long you live, but what we need to increase is health span, which is the number of years that you're living a healthy life. Medicine 2.0 has increased lifespan, but not health span. Many people spend the last few years of life with severe disabilities, as noted at the bottom of the Medicine 2.0 curve. Our focus today should be increased health span, and that is referred as to Medicine 3.0. The greatest challenge increasing health span is to improve long-term outcomes. We know that there's a higher incidence of ADHD in infants less than 1 year of age undergoing heart surgery. Some of that's genetic, some of them may be related to cerebral blood flow during gestation and bypass. There is some weak evidence of an increased risk of dementia and also Parkinson's disease in adult patients that have had open heart surgery. But without long-term follow-up, it's impossible to examine our practices to reduce their risks. One way to change our practice in the future may be monitoring cerebral autoregulation. This technique looks at correlation between mean arterial pressure and cerebral oximetry. Research initially done at Johns Hopkins has shown that there is a wide variability between patients in the cerebral autoregulation range. Below the autoregulation range, decrease in cerebral blood flow increases the risk of cerebral ischemia and stroke. Above the autoregulation range, increased cerebral blood flow is associated with delirium. As technology improves and becomes more reliable, I hope there will be a working system in the OR to determine each patient's individual cerebral autoregulation range, and then we can maintain blood pressure within that range for each patient. This is one of the first papers in the JEC literature that discusses the issues with this technology. I urge you to stay tuned. The percentage of the population over 65 years will more than double between 2000 and 2050, and there's a significant projected increase in the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. This will dramatically increase the need for our services, and we are seeing this already, but we need to focus more on managing these patients differently and incorporating this into perfusion school curriculum. Finally, I would like to implore you to help prepare the next generations of perfusionists. As we start to see a constant wave of perfusionists retiring, we need to fill that gap with competent, highly educated individuals, hopefully with at least a master's degree, and maybe in the future, a doctorate. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my family for their love and support during my perfusion career. I could never have done it without them. As I look in the audience, it's a little bright, but I'm looking out into the audience. I suspect that many of the next Gibbon Award winners are out there. I urge you to carry on in the scientific tradition of John Gibbon and the rest of the Gibbon Award winners. It's time to pass the torch to you, a new generation of practicing perfusionists, to accomplish the next great scientific advancements in the profession. And finally, I'd like to play a song that I wrote for graduation several years ago, and I'd like to thank you for this tremendous honor. Hope this comes out. Take my wings and fly, and don't get tired. Take my wings and fly, fill your desire. Take my wings and fly, never forget when we first met. Had a dream, being the best, and you'll be that yet. Take my wings and fly, don't get tired. Take my wings and fly, fill your desires. Take my wings and fly, I'll always remember this day forever. Now is the time, go your own way and find your passion in life. Take my wings and fly, don't get tired. Take my wings and fly, fill your desires. Take my wings and fly. Thank you.
I would like to congratulate again our national award winners, Greg, Scott, and Joe. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, and congratulations.
If you can hold on just one moment, we have one last, the President's Award. It has been an absolute honor to work with Tammy over the last several years. She is an amazing example of leadership in our profession. Not only has Tammy been a member of AmSect leadership for the last 7 years, she serves on the executive committee of 2 professional societies at the same time as an executive officer of the American Academy. And she does all of this while co-chairing our leadership symposium, managing a busy program at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and maintaining a busy lecture schedule, which seemingly has her presenting at about every state and national conference that I ever get to attend. The